Welcome to Diplomacy in International Relations, a podcast focused on international relations, global politics, and Danish political developments.
Yeah.
Have you ever noticed that the loudest political threats usually have, the quietest loopholes?
Oh, absolutely. That is practically a rule of statecraft right now.
Right. Well, in today's analysis, we are looking at why a 100% global tariff isn't actually a tariff.
And why deciding to build an umbrella factory in the middle of a Category 5 hurricane somehow makes perfect sense to the military-industrial complex.
Exactly. We are also going to break down how to tell if a high-stakes diplomatic peace summit is actually real or if it's just, a theatrical performance for voters back home.
Yeah, we're really pulling apart the intersections of economic warfare, military reality, and diplomatic theater today.
We are. But before we get into the mechanisms behind this week's global headlines, a quick reminder for you, our listener. Please take a moment to follow and subscribe to the podcast so you never miss a discussion.
And specifically, you can also follow iCulture Talking on Instagram for even more updates.
Yes, definitely do that. So jumping right in, we are currently staring at a geopolitical landscape that feels, entirely defined by contradictions.
Yeah, completely.
If you listen to the political rhetoric,
Yeah.
the war is ending tomorrow, the enemy is exhausted, and the global economy is, locked down.
But if you look at the actual supply chains and the trade data, a completely different story emerges.
Right. And to understand what is actually happening globally, we need to begin by examining the primary non-kinetic weapon being used in global diplomacy right now.
Which is, of course, economic sanctions and tariffs.
Exactly. So how is this playing out?
Well, that tension between political rhetoric and economic reality, that's the defining feature of modern statecraft. Economic warfare has essentially become the default opening move.
Right.
And we just saw a massive legislative maneuver on this front. The U.S. Senate recently advanced the bipartisan Lindsey Graham Sanctioning Russia and Iran Act of 2026.
It was an 86-12 procedural vote, right?
Yeah, 86-12. And the optics were very heavily managed. Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky was actually sitting in the Senate gallery watching the vote take place.
Wow. Okay, so let's break down what a procedural vote actually means for the listener who doesn't spend their days watching congressional proceedings.
Sure.
An 86-12 margin is huge, but this wasn't the final passage of the law into the books, was it?
No, it wasn't. A procedural vote is essentially just the Senate agreeing to clear the floor and prioritize debating the bill.
Okay, so it just overcomes the initial hurdles.
Exactly. It gets past the stuff that usually stalls legislation. But getting 86 senators to agree on anything in 2026 is, it's a massive signal of bipartisan momentum.
And the sheer mechanics of this bill are pretty sweeping. It aims to impose crippling tariffs on the world's top 5 purchasers of Russian oil and natural gas.
Yeah, and when you look at the macro data, that provision is squarely targeting China and India.
Because they've effectively stepped in to absorb the energy exports that Europe just refused to buy. But how does this actually work mechanically? We are talking about secondary tariffs here.
Right, so secondary tariffs are where economic warfare gets highly aggressive. A primary sanction is the U.S. saying, we will not buy Russian oil.
Just a direct block.
Yes. But a secondary tariff is the U.S. turning to a third party, let's say India, and saying, if you continue to buy Russian oil, we are going to place a 100% tax on the textiles, the technology, and the pharmaceuticals that you try to sell to American consumers.
Oh, wow. So it's literally the weaponization of American market access.
That's exactly what it is. The U.S. is forcing third-party nations to choose between cheap Russian energy and access to the incredibly lucrative U.S. consumer base.
But, wielding a weapon that large comes with massive collateral damage, which I guess explains the domestic pushback we're seeing.
Yeah, it definitely does.
Because Democratic Senator Ron Wyden expressed profound skepticism about the legislation. And just looking at his position impartially here, his concern isn't about protecting Russia.
No, not at all.
It is centered squarely on granting Donald Trump massive new unilateral tariff powers. Wyden's argument, and again, just reporting the differing viewpoints here, is that handing over this level of executive authority could severely disrupt global supply chains.
And trigger a massive wave of domestic inflation.
Exactly.
Yeah, Wyden is pointing to the inherent vulnerability in the system. You have this bipartisan desire in the Senate to squeeze the Russian war machine financially,
Right.
but it collides head-on with domestic economic anxieties. I mean, if you suddenly slap a 100% tariff on Indian and Chinese goods, the cost of everyday items for the American consumer just skyrockets overnight.
Right. It hits the wallet immediately. And to understand how this plays out in reality rather than just on paper, we have to look at the recent historical track record.
Which is very telling.
Really is.
Huh.
Let's trace the data on India. In August of 2025, Donald Trump imposed a 25% tariff on India specifically for purchasing Russian oil.
Which created a 50% baseline tariff on their goods entering the U.S.
Right. But by February of 2026, so just a few months later, that massive economic wall was quietly dismantled and the tariff was withdrawn.
Yeah, and the conditions for that withdrawal reveal exactly how this game is played.
Do tell.
Well, the tariffs were dropped after Indian companies agreed to stop buying Russian oil, but, and this is key, they included a highly specific caveat.
Which was?
They would stop buying, quote unquote, unless absolutely necessary, or to fulfill existing contracts.
Wait, unless absolutely necessary.
Yeah.
I mean, that is a loophole big enough to drive a super tanker through.
It really is.
Why even announce a massive secondary tariff if you're just going to give one of the primary targets a free pass a few months later? It just makes the threat look completely toothless.
It does look that way, yeah.
So are these looming threats of 100% secondary tariffs on China and India a genuine sanctions revolution, or is it just a geopolitical bluff?
It feels like a teacher threatening the entire class with detention, but carving out so many loopholes for the popular kids that the threat entirely loses its bite. The detention analogy actually gets right to the heart of it, but let's look at the mechanism behind the bluff.
Okay.
What we are witnessing is the friction between passing sweeping, symbolic bills, like the Graham Act, and the granular, fragile reality of global economics.
Right.
In practice, massive secondary tariffs are rarely enforced as permanent walls. Instead, they operate more like a dial.
A dial.
Yeah. The U.S. turns the dial up to threaten a catastrophic economic penalty. This forces the target nation to the negotiating table in an absolute state of panic. Then, the U.S. quietly accepts a vague compromise like India's unless necessary clause, and they just turn the dial back down.
So the goal isn't to permanently break trade with India.
Exactly. The goal is to extract a short-term geopolitical concession without actually triggering global inflation. The threat itself is the weapon, not the actual tariff.
Wow. But if economic warfare is riddled with these intentional massive loopholes, it creates a really dangerous ripple effect, doesn't it?
It does.
Because if adversaries know these tariffs are just temporary pressure tactics, they have no economic incentive to slow their advance.
None at all.
And that realization forces countries like Ukraine to look past these porous economic shields and rely almost entirely on hard military assets.
Which brings us directly to the realities on the battlefield.
Yes, and the highly contradictory news surrounding Ukraine's air defenses.
Right. The pivot from economic maneuvering to military logistics is incredibly stark here, because while a tariff can be, paused or waived with a signature in Washington, a defense manufacturing supply chain operates on physical laws.
You cannot bluff a missile into existence.
Exactly. You cannot.
And here is where the timeline gets really interesting. President Zelensky recently held a high-profile meeting with Raytheon Vice President Joseph D'Antona.
Yeah.
And they announced that Ukraine will co-manufacture Patriot interceptor missiles. This follows a political agreement that was reportedly struck with Donald Trump at the NATO summit in Ankara on July 8th.
Right. So on the surface, the public framing suggests this massive leap forward for Ukrainian military self-reliance.
Yeah.
But when you synthesize the reporting across different sources, the contradictions just immediately begin to pile up.
Yes, starting with the physical location of this manufacturing.
Exactly. The Kyiv Independent reported this development as a major domestic production win, which clearly implies these interceptors will be built on Ukrainian soil.
But hold on, because Reuters reported something entirely different.
They did.
Their sources claim that production will actually be based in Germany or perhaps another European country simply because it is, quote-unquote, safer.
Yeah.
The Reuters report even noted that production might only relocate to Ukraine after the war ends.
And that makes sense, honestly. Moving defense manufacturing into an active war zone introduces supply chain vulnerabilities that major contractors like Raytheon are rarely willing to absorb.
Right. I mean, building a Patriot interceptor, specifically the advanced variants like the PAC-2 or PAC-3, is not like assembling a car.
No, not at all. It requires highly specialized microelectronics, solid-state radar components, incredibly secure facilities.
Right.
A single drone strike on a critical component facility in Kyiv could set production back by years.
So the reality of building them in Germany makes logistical sense, even if it completely contradicts the domestic victory narrative.
Exactly. And then you have the second major contradiction, which centers on U.S. policy itself.
Right, because despite that July 8th agreement in Ankara, Donald Trump walked back the promise on July 31st.
You did.
He expressed open doubts about granting Patriot production licenses, citing fears of divulging highly classified American defense technology secrets.
Yeah.
So you have an announcement of production, a dispute over where it will happen, and the U.S. executive branch questioning if they will even grant the licenses in the first place.
It's a mess. And then we hit the most glaring contradiction of all, which is the assessment of the battlefield itself.
Oh, this one is striking.
Right, because we have political figures aggressively pushing a narrative of a winding down conflict.
Yeah, U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance recently stated on the record that Russia's offensive capabilities are, quote, approaching zero.
But the reality on the ground actively and violently disputes that. Just overnight, Russia launched a massive ballistic missile strike on Kyiv.
Killing 9 people and injuring 27.
Right, and simultaneously, the Ukrainian General Staff reported 238 clashes in a single day, heavily concentrated on the Kostiantynivka front.
Let's just pause on that number for a second. 238 clashes in 24 hours?
Yeah.
That requires massive artillery consumption, drone swarms, and constant logistical resupply. That does not look like a military force with zero offensive capability.
The disconnect is profound.
Yeah.
When you map these data points against each other, a very stark picture emerges about how different actors are actually planning for the timeline of this conflict.
So what does this attempt to build a Patriot production line actually signal about the war's time horizon? Because I keep thinking of an analogy. It's like deciding to build an umbrella factory in your living room while a hurricane is currently tearing the roof off your house.
That's a great way to put it.
You don't do that if you think the storm is passing tomorrow. You only sign a multi-year lease on that factory if the meteorologists are telling you this storm is going to sit over your house for the next decade.
Exactly.
Setting up complex aerospace manufacturing implies you are planning for a war that lasts far into the future.
You've isolated the exact core mechanism at play here. The rhetoric from politicians claiming Russia's capabilities are nearing zero, or that a swift diplomatic resolution is imminent, it completely clashes with the logistical reality of setting up multi-year defense production contracts.
Because defense contractors don't work on quick timelines.
No, they operate on 5, sometimes 10-year horizons. They do not invest capital in international production lines, specialized labor, and highly secure supply chains for a war that is ending tomorrow.
Okay.
The push to manufacture Patriots in Europe, with the potential of moving to Ukraine years down the line, it signals a long-term entrenched conflict.
So the military-industrial complex is preparing for years of sustained, high-intensity warfare, regardless of the optimistic, short-term political messaging being broadcast to the voters.
Precisely.
So if the military contractors are digging in for a decade, but the politicians promise the public a quick resolution, you get a massive pressure cooker.
You do.
People want an end to the conflict, and leaders need to show progress. And the steam valve for that political pressure is diplomatic theater.
Yes.
This pressure really explains the sudden flurry of high-level yet deeply confusing diplomatic meetings we've seen recently.
It does. And the diplomatic track requires the most careful scrutiny of all right now.
Why is that?
Because it is incredibly easy to mistake activity for actual progress. A prime example of this just occurred at the ASEAN Regional Forum in Manila.
Right, where U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio and Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov held a 35-minute meeting.
Yeah. And the Russian Foreign Ministry went out of its way to publicly point out that the U.S. initiated this meeting.
Which is interesting. Why does that matter?
It is a classic diplomatic framing tactic. By stating the U.S. initiated the meeting, Russia signals to its domestic audience and its global allies that the West is the one seeking a way out.
Ah, so it projects a posture of Russian strength.
Exactly. But to understand if a brief 35-minute chat in Manila is actually substantive, we have to look at the historical playbook for these kinds of encounters.
And the most relevant parallel provided in the sources is the U.S.-Taliban peace talks in 2019.
Right, which were driven by U.S. envoys Zalmay Khalilzad and Donald Trump.
The source material explicitly draws this comparison, and it is fascinating. Those 2019 talks were highly theatrical.
Very much so.
You had unannounced dramatic presidential visits to the Bagram Air Base, highly secretive negotiations that excluded the actual Afghan government, and sudden suspensions of talks via social media due to localized violence.
Yeah, the entire process seemed primarily focused on American domestic optics.
Specifically, getting troop withdrawal numbers down to secure a political win before an election cycle.
Exactly. Rather than laying out a comprehensive, structural, regional stability plan that included necessary players like Pakistan, India, or Russia.
Right. The 2019 talks prioritized the appearance of deal-making over the tedious structural reality of peace-building.
And by prioritizing a quick headline for Washington, they undermined the long-term stability of the region.
And currently, we are seeing incredibly similar theatrics regarding Ukraine.
We really are.
I mean, the mixed messaging is just dizzying. On one hand, you have Zelensky aggressively asking for permission to use American Starlink technology to actively target and destroy Russian ballistic launchers deep inside Russian territory.
Which is a clear push for kinetic escalation.
Yes. But on the other hand, you have Donald Trump simultaneously commenting to the press that the U.S. can take pretty much whatever we want in a new U.S.-Ukraine minerals deal.
It is a totally jarring juxtaposition.
It really is.
You have active military escalation operating side by side with this transactional, almost mercantile political rhetoric.
So I just have to ask, is this so-called peace talks revival primarily a domestic politics performance in Washington?
Well,
Because at the same time, doesn't every legitimate peace process start as secretive political theater before it becomes substantive? How can we, as observers trying to make sense of the news, actually tell the difference between a real off-ramp and a PR stunt?
that is the core question, and the difference lies entirely in the underlying structure of the diplomacy, not the press releases.
Okay, I'll unpack that a bit.
Genuine peace talks involve quiet, multilateral alignment. They require bringing regional players and economic stakeholders to the table over months, sometimes years, to ensure that a ceasefire can actually be sustained, monitored, and enforced.
That makes sense.
Performative peace talks, conversely, feature abrupt, highly publicized meetings, like a short 35-minute chat on the sidelines of a forum in Manila.
Right.
They feature public walkbacks on critical weapons deals, and they rely heavily on public posturing about resource extraction, like those mineral deal comments.
So it's really about who the audience is.
Yeah.
A real negotiation is aimed at the adversary,
Exactly.
but a performative negotiation is aimed at the voters watching cable news.
Exactly that. Right now, the diplomatic track seems heavily geared toward showing voters back home that deals are being made and that leadership is taking action.
While avoiding the actual hard work.
Yeah, it avoids the incredibly tedious multi-year groundwork required for a sustainable ceasefire because that groundwork doesn't produce daily headlines. It is diplomacy designed for the 24-hour news cycle, not for the history books.
Which leaves us with a lot to consider.
It really does. I mean, if economic sanctions are constantly waived through massive loopholes for temporary convenience,
Right.
and if defense production timelines stretch far beyond the promises of political campaigns, and if diplomatic talks are merely performances orchestrated for a domestic audience, who or what is actually in control of the timeline for global stability?
That is a staggering thought.
Are we witnessing a new era where long-term foreign policy is entirely subservient to the 24-hour domestic news cycle?
Wow. That is definitely a profound question for you to mull over as you watch the next round of headlines break.
Absolutely.
Thank you, as always, to you, our listener, for spending your time with us today and engaging with the deeper mechanisms behind these complex topics.
Yeah, thanks for tuning in.
Please remember to follow the podcast, and we would greatly appreciate it if you could take a moment to leave us a 5-star rating. It truly helps expand the podcast's reach so we can keep bringing you these discussions. Keep questioning the narrative, and we will see you next time.